The Galactic Marine Corps Academy's admission chamber was designed to intimidate. Towering crystalline walls pulse with bioluminescent patterns, while gravity fluctuated subtly, just enough to remind visitors they weren't on their homeworlds anymore. For most candidates, these effects barely registered. The Vraxians with their quantum-enhanced nervous systems, the ethereal luminary who existed partially in 11 dimensions, and the silicon-based Petrovi who could survive in the heart of a star. They all stood unfazed. But Sarah Chin was human, and her stomach lurched with each gravity wave. Candidate 47,219, announced High Commander Vex Thor, his 4 eyes scanning a holographic display. Your species designation is human. The last word carried the same tone someone might use for a particularly stubborn virus. Sarah stood at attention, her standard-issue envirosuit feeling too loose in some places and too tight in others. Yes, High Commander. A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the admission board. The luminary representative's glow flickered in patterns that translated roughly to second-hand embarrassment. Your physical assessment scores are. Vex Thor paused, mandibles clicking. Concerning. Strength rating. 2.1 on the Galactic Standard Scale, barely above minimum requirements. Reaction time. 0.23 seconds. Laughably slow. No natural armor, no secondary respiratory system, no psychic potential. He looked up from the display. Explain why we should not reject your application immediately. Sarah had rehearsed this moment countless times, but standing before the board, words failed her. Instead, she reached for the data tablet at her hip. Permission to demonstrate something, High Commander. Vex Thor waved a limb dismissively. Proceed. Sarah's fingers danced across the tablet's surface. The chamber's holographic systems engaged, and suddenly they were surrounded by stars. This is the Battle of Thermopylae, she began. The display showed ancient warriors holding a narrow pass. 300 soldiers against an army of tens of thousands. Primitive combat, scoffed one of the Petrovi representatives. What relevance? They held for 3 days, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, not with superior technology or physical prowess, but through position, strategy, and understanding of terrain. The scene shifted. The Battle of Agincourt, the Siege of Stalingrad, the Tet Offensive. Each historical battle materialized around them. Human history is filled with examples of inferior forces defeating superior ones through adaptation and unconventional thinking. The chamber fell silent. Even the luminary's glow steadied. In every one of these battles, Sarah said, meeting Vex Thor's 4-eyed gaze, the force with overwhelming physical and technological advantages lost. They lost because they couldn't conceive of fighting anyway except head-on. They lost because they couldn't adapt. She deactivated the display. I may be physically weaker than every other candidate here, but I come from a species that has spent its entire history learning how to overcome superior forces. That's what I offer the Academy, a different way of thinking about warfare. High Commander Vex Thor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of deep thought among his species. You believe ancient human battles have relevance to modern galactic combat. I believe any military force that assumes superior technology or physical strength guarantees victory is destined for defeat, Sarah replied. The admission board members exchanged glances, their various anatomies expressing emotions Sarah couldn't fully interpret. Finally, Vex Thor spoke. Candidate 47,219. Your application is. He paused, mandibles clicking again. Provisionally accepted. Sarah's heart leaped, but she maintained her rigid posture. However, Vex Thor continued, you will be subject to the same standards as all other cadets. No allowances will be made for your limitations. Understood, High Commander. As Sarah left the chamber, she heard the luminary representative's crystalline voice. Either this will be a historic mistake or a fascinating experiment. The next morning, Sarah stood with her fellow first-year cadets in the Academy's main training ground. The artificial sun cast harsh shadows across the assembled beings, each representing the peak of their species' evolutionary development. Next to Avraxian, whose muscle density could deflect small arms fire, Sarah looked like a child's toy. Training Sergeant Kavox, a veteran Petrovi with a crystalline form that had been shaped by countless battles, paced before them. The Galactic Marine Corps exists to face threats that would annihilate lesser forces. His voice grated like stones grinding together. Many of you will fail. Some of you may die. This is acceptable. Better to fail here than to fail when billions of lives depend on you. His crystalline gaze fixed on Sarah. Those who lack natural advantages must prove their worth through other means, or they will be removed. The day that followed tested every limit of human endurance. While her classmates easily handled the enhanced gravity exercises, Sarah's muscles screamed in protest. During reflex training, she dove for cover seconds after everyone else had already moved. Each failure drew stares, some pitying, others contemptuous. But in the final exercise of the day, something changed. The cadets were presented with a tactical simulation: defend a colonial outpost with limited resources against an overwhelming force. While her classmates requisitioned the most powerful weapons and shields in the simulation, Sarah studied the outpost's layout. Time to contact. 60 seconds, announced the simulation eye. Sarah's hands flew across the tactical interface. She diverted power from the shields, causing several of her classmates to protest. Instead, she activated the outpost's atmospheric processors, superheating specific air corridors. "What are you doing?" demanded Avraxian cadet. "We need those shields. We need to think differently," Sarah replied, fingers still moving. "Watch." When the enemy force arrived, they found their expected attack vectors turned into superheated wind tunnels. Their formations broke apart as they tried to avoid the searing air currents. In the chaos, the defenders picked them off with minimal ammunition expenditure. As the simulation ended, Training Sergeant Kavox's crystalline form shifted in what might have been approval. An interesting approach, Cadet Chen. Using environmental systems as weapons. Unconventional, but effective. Sarah stood straighter, ignoring her aching muscles. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Do not thank me yet," Kavox rumbled. "Tomorrow will be worse." As the cadets filed out of the training ground, Sarah noticed something had changed. The contemptuous stares had been replaced with thoughtful glances. She had survived day one. But more importantly, she had shown there was more than one way to fight. In her quarters that night, Sarah reviewed the day's training footage, already planning how to adapt human tactical doctrines to her new environment. She might be the physically weakest cadet in the Academy's history, but she was determined to prove that humanity's greatest strength had never been in its muscles or bones. It had always been in its ability to think differently. 3 weeks into training, Sarah Chen discovered that her body could, in fact, survive things she previously thought impossible. Whether it should was another question entirely. Again. Training Sergeant Kavox's crystalline voice reverberated through the combat chamber. The gravity shifted to 4 times galactic standard, and Sarah's legs trembled with the effort of staying upright. Around her, her classmates moved with varying degrees of discomfort, but none showed the strain she felt. The holographic opponent materialized, a 12-foot combat drone modeled after the feared Nexus Raiders. Sarah's envirosuit sensors screamed warnings as the drone charged, its plasma fields leaving scorched patterns in the deck plating. She didn't try to match its strength. That would have been suicide. Instead, she waited until the last possible moment, then dropped and rolled. In enhanced gravity, the movement felt like tumbling through wet cement, but it worked. The drone's momentum carried it past her, and she managed to slap a simulated breach charge onto its lower housing as it passed. The drone exploded in a shower of holographic shrapnel. Sarah lay on the deck, gasping for breath. Unconventional, Kavox noted, his crystalline form shifting in what she'd learned to recognize as mild approval. But effective. Though in real combat, You would have sustained severe gravitational stress injuries from that maneuver. Better, then, being. Vaporize, Sarah managed between breaths. A ripple of what might have been laughter moved through the observing cadets. Even some of those who'd initially been the most dismissive of her had begun to watch her methods with interest. But not everyone was impressed. Cadet Arc-6, a Vraxian whose combat scores led the class, stepped forward. Permission to speak, Sergeant. Granted. While Cadet Chen's creative approaches are entertaining, they undermine the core principles of Galactic Marine combat doctrine. We are meant to be unstoppable forces, not scurrying prey animals. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her muscles protesting every movement. History suggests that unstoppable forces have a habit of being stopped by opponents they underestimate. Theory class is down the hall, Arc-6 retorted, his auxiliary combat arms flexing beneath his carapace. This is about real combat. Kivox's crystalline form pulsed with sudden intensity. Perhaps a practical demonstration is in order. Team exercise. Arc-6, select 3 classmates. Chen, the same. Orbital defense scenario. Sarah's heart sank. In team combat, her physical limitations wouldn't just endanger her. They'd put others at risk. But as she looked around the chamber, she saw several cadets actually step forward to volunteer for her team. The first was Tellar, a luminary whose 11-dimensional perception had initially made her seem aloof, but who had begun asking Sarah questions about human battle tactics. The second was Crix, a Petrovi who had struggled with the rigid combat doctrines despite his species' natural advantages. The third, surprisingly, was Zinra, a Nexus hybrid whose ancestors had once been the raiders that the combat drones were modeled after. The simulation engaged. They found themselves on a small orbital platform, defending against waves of incoming hostile forces. Arc-6's team took up standard positions, their superior physical abilities and advanced weaponry forming a formidable defense line. Sarah gathered her team close. We're going to do this differently. Tellar, can you use your dimensional perception to identify structural weak points in the platform? The luminary's glow pulsed with interest. Against doctrine, but yes. Good. Crix, your crystalline form can channel energy, right? And Zinra, you have ancestral memory of raider attack patterns. Both nodded. Then here's what we're going to do. The first wave hit both teams equally hard. Arc-6's group responded with overwhelming force, their coordinated fire creating a killing zone that nothing could penetrate. Sarah's team appeared to fall back in disarray. Predictable, Arc-6 commented, his mandibles clicking in satisfaction. Then Sarah's plan unfolded. Tellar had identified maintenance passages that existed partially in other dimensions. While Arc-6's team focused on the direct assault, Sarah's group used these passages to outflank the attackers. Crix channeled power from the platform's systems through his crystalline form, creating electromagnetic pulses that disrupted enemy shields. Zinra, using her ancestral knowledge, predicted and countered the attackers' adaptation attempts. Multiple breach attempts detected, the simulation AI announced. Platform integrity at 60% and falling. Press the advantage. Arc-6 ordered his team, committing their reserves to a counterattack. Sarah smiled. That's exactly what she'd been waiting for. Now, she commanded. Her team triggered the charges they'd planted during their earlier retreat. Sections of the platform's outer hull blew outward, creating a debris field that disrupted the attackers' formation. More importantly, it forced Arc-6's team to split their attention. In the chaos that followed, Sarah's team demonstrated why humanity's greatest military victories had often come from being scurrying prey animals. They struck from unexpected angles, used the environment as a weapon, and never, ever fought fair. When the simulation ended, Sarah's team had suffered minimal casualties while achieving all defense objectives. Arc-6's team, despite their superior capabilities, had been forced to fall back repeatedly. The chamber was silent as Kivox reviewed the combat data. Finally, he spoke. Cadet Chen's team achieved a 47% higher efficiency rating while using 63% less energy and ammunition. His crystalline form shifted to address the entire class. This demonstrates a crucial lesson. Superior force is meaningless without superior tactics. Arxix's mandibles clicked in agitation. But, Sergeant, the methods used violated 17 standard combat protocols. Indeed, Kavox agreed. And in doing so, they succeeded where standard protocols would have failed. He turned to Sarah. Your historical knowledge suggested this outcome. Explain. Sarah straightened despite her exhaustion. The Battle of Trenton, Earth Year 1776. A colonial force defeated a superior British army by attacking during a holiday. Through a storm, when such an attack was considered impossible. The defenders' adherence to standard doctrine became a weakness that could be exploited. She looked around at her classmates. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest guns or strongest armor. It's the one who thinks differently than you expect. As they filed out of the chamber, Sarah noticed more cadets than ever before were watching her with thoughtful expressions. She'd proven that humanity's perceived weaknesses, their need to improvise, to adapt, to find alternatives to direct confrontation, could actually be strengths. But she also noticed Arxix's rigid posture, the way his combat arms remained partially extended. She'd won the day, but she'd also made a dangerous enemy. In the days to come, she would need every bit of human ingenuity to survive what came next. The Academy's Strategic Command Center wasn't meant to be quiet. The constant hum of quantum processors, the crystalline chimes of luminary data streams, and the subsonic rumbles of Petrovi communications usually filled the space with a symphony of advanced civilization. But now, as the holographic display showed the utter destruction of yet another frontier outpost, the silence was deafening. Sarah stood with her fellow senior cadets, watching as the recording played out. The outpost's defenses had been state-of-the-art. Phase shields, quantum-locked armor, AI-driven response systems. None of it had mattered. The attacking force had torn through everything like tissue paper. Seventh incident this quarter, announced Fleet Commander Vextor, his 4 eyes fixed on the display. No survivors, no recoverable data, and no explanation for the failure of our defensive systems. Sarah studied the attack pattern, her mind racing through historical parallels. Something about it seemed familiar, but not from any of the Academy's combat databases. Permission to access the historical archives during this briefing, Commander, she asked. Several of her classmates shifted uncomfortably. Even after months of Sarah's increasingly respected tactical innovations, some still saw her reliance on ancient history as primitive, but Vextor simply nodded. As censored data from the attack played across the main display, Sarah dove into humanity's military archives. The attack pattern, the way the enemy seemed to simply ignore advanced defenses. There, she whispered, then louder, Commander, I believe I've seen something similar to this before. Vextor's mandibles clicked in interest. Explain. Sarah sent data to the main display. Earth Year 1415. The Battle of Agincourt. English longbowmen versus French knights in plate armor. The French had what they believed to be impenetrable defenses. The English had a weapon that simply bypassed those defenses completely. Ancient projectile weapons hardly seem relevant to quantum phase attacks. Arxix interrupted, his carapace bristling. The principle is the same, Sarah countered. The French knights thought their armor made them invulnerable, just like we think our energy shields and quantum barriers make us safe. But when faced with a completely different type of threat, she gestured to the destruction on display. Crix, who had become one of her closest allies, shifted his crystalline form in agreement, like how your primitive breach charges proved more effective than standard plasma weapons in last month's exercises. Commander Vextor's eyes narrowed. You believe these attacks represent a fundamental challenge to our defensive doctrine. I believe we're making the same mistake those French knights made, Sarah said. We're so convinced of the superiority of our defenses that we can't conceive of them being irrelevant. The briefing room erupted in discussion. various species communicating in their native forms. Sarah noticed Tellar's dimensional shifts becoming more agitated, a sign of deep concern from the luminary. Silence, Vex Thor commanded, and the room stilled. Cadet Chen, you've proven your unconventional thinking has merit. What do you suggest? Sarah took a deep breath. We need to fundamentally change how we think about defense. Stop relying solely on technology we don't fully understand and start incorporating more robust methods. You want us to take steps backward? Arc-6 demanded. Abandon generations of advanced military development for primitive human tactics. I want us to survive, Sarah replied firmly. Right now, our enemies are doing to us exactly what humanity has done throughout its history, finding ways to make superior force irrelevant. The commander's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this. Finally, he straightened. Cadet Chen, effective immediately, you will develop an alternative tactical training program. Focus on these robust methods you mentioned. Attendance will be voluntary. Sarah blinked in surprise. Sir, I'm still a cadet myself. A cadet who has consistently demonstrated the kind of thinking we may desperately need. His eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stand straighter. Do not make me regret this decision. As the briefing dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by a mix of curious and hostile faces. Tellar's multidimensional form shimmed closer. I will attend your training, the luminary announced. Our dimensional perception may combine interestingly with your tactical approaches. Count me in too, Crix added, his crystalline surface refracting with enthusiasm. These attacks have proven we need new perspectives. One by one, more cadets stepped forward. Even some who had once mocked her expressed interest. But Arc-6 and his closest followers held back, their postures radiating disapproval. This is a mistake, Arc-6 declared, one that will weaken the entire course. Sarah met his compound eyes steadily. The only true weakness is refusing to adapt. Later that night, as Sarah prepared training materials in her quarters, she received an unexpected visit from Sergeant Kavox. The veteran's crystalline form was clouded with concern. You understand what's really happening, don't you? He asked without preamble. Sarah nodded slowly. The frontier attacks. They're tests. Someone or something is probing our defenses, learning our responses. Just as you would do, Kavox observed. Yes. Which means they think like you do. Kavox's form shifted to a more serious configuration. They're looking for weaknesses, analyzing patterns, preparing for something bigger. Sarah felt a chill despite her envirosuit's temperature control. How long do you think we have? Not long enough to change everything, Kavox replied, but perhaps long enough to change enough. As the sergeant left, Sarah turned back to her tactical analyses with renewed urgency. She had studied countless battles where supposedly inferior forces had triumphed through innovative thinking. Now she had to prepare her fellow cadets for the possibility that they were about to be on the receiving end of such tactics. The next morning, as she faced her first group of volunteers, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The most important lesson from human military history, she began, is that no advantage lasts forever. The only constant is change. Today, we're going to learn how to be that change. Unknown to everyone in the academy, out in the darkness of space, something was indeed watching, learning, and preparing. And it had already identified the biggest weakness in the Galactic Marine Corps, their certainty in their own superiority. The attack came during the Academy's night cycle, when most of the advanced defense systems were in their diagnostic modes. Sarah was in the tactical training room, running simulations with Tellar and Crix, when every screen suddenly went dark. That's not supposed to happen, Crix said, his crystalline form dimming with concern. The quantum cores have redundant backups. Tellar's multidimensional form rippled with alarm. I'm detecting spatial anomalies throughout the facility, similar to the frontier attack patterns. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Can you still access the emergency channels? Before Tellar could answer, Commander Vex Thor's voice crackled through the facility's ancient backup speakers. Technology so old it was usually ignored. This is not a drill. Unknown forces have breached our primary defenses. All advanced systems are non-responsive. All cadets implement emergency protocols. The transmission cut off in a burst of static. "They're here," Sarah whispered. Then louder. "And they just showed us their first weakness." Crix's form shifted in confusion. "What weakness?" "They've disabled everything." "Not everything." Sarah moved to a manual control panel that most cadets didn't even know existed. "They took out our advanced systems, but ignored the older ones, just like we've been doing in our training." She activated the panel, and harsh emergency lighting cast red shadows through the corridors. "Tellar, can you still perceive multiple dimensions?" The luminary's form pulsed. "Yes, though my enhanced sensory interfaces are offline." "Good. We need to gather as many cadets as we can." "Crix, can you transmit through your crystalline structure?" "Basic vibrations only. Nothing complex." "Basic is all we need. Start sending out a pattern. 3 pulses, pause, repeat. Anyone who's been in our training sessions will recognize it." As Crix began transmitting, Sarah grabbed what looked like antique equipment from a storage locker. Physical compasses, mechanical rangefinders, and simple chemical illumination sticks. "What are you thinking?" Tellar asked, helping to distribute the equipment. "They expected us to rely on our advanced technology, just like every overconfident force in history." Sarah checked a paper map she'd kept as part of her teaching materials. "They'll be heading for the quantum cores, expecting us to either surrender or try to restore power." Instead, a grim smile crossed Sarah's face. "Instead, we're going to show them why humanity survived before we had all this technology." Over the next hour, cadets who had attended Sarah's training sessions began arriving in small groups. Even Arxix appeared, his carapace showing signs of combat. "The main defense center is lost," he reported grudgingly. "These beings, they simply walk through energy shields. Weapons pass right through them. Because they're partially out of phase with our reality," Sarah explained. "Tellar, is that what you're seeing?" The luminary's form sparkled with revelation. "Yes, they exist across multiple dimensional planes, making our single-dimension defenses useless. But not everything has to be high-tech to be effective," Sarah said, laying out her plan. "Arxix, your species can generate bioelectrical fields naturally, right?" His mandibles clicked in affirmation. "And Crix, your crystalline form can channel and amplify energy." "Basic physics," the Petrovi confirmed. "Tellar, can you perceive where these beings are most anchored to our reality?" "Their convergence points." "Yes." Sarah nodded. "Then we have what we need. Here's how we're going to fight back." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Using Tellar's perception, they identified where the invaders were most vulnerable. Arxix and other bioelectrical-capable species generated fields that Crix's people amplified through their crystalline forms. The result was a crude but effective way to force the beings fully into normal space, making them vulnerable to even the most basic physical attacks. Like forcing a submarine to surface, Sarah explained to her confused allies. "Doesn't matter how advanced, it is underwater if you can make it fight on your terms." They moved through the academy in small teams, using paper maps and hand signals. Without relying on any technology more advanced than simple machines, they began to take back their home one section at a time. The invaders, for all their dimensional superiority, had no counter for such primitive tactics. They had disabled the academy's quantum lock doors, only to find cadets using actual physical barricades. They could phase through energy shields but found themselves stumbling over simple tripwires. Sarah led a team toward the main reactor core, where their sensors indicated the largest concentration of invaders. Along the way, they found evidence of the attackers' overconfidence. They had completely ignored potential threats that didn't register as technology. "Remember," Sarah whispered to her team, "hubris is always the greatest weakness. They think they've blinded us by taking out our advanced systems. They don't realize we can fight blind. The final battle for the reactor core proved her point. The invaders, creatures of shifting mass and impossible geometries, had expected to face desperate attempts to restore power. Instead, they found themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated trap of physical forces and fundamental physics. "Now," Sarah shouted, and her diverse team of cadets executed their roles perfectly. Tellar identified weak points, Arxix's team generated the fields, Crix's people amplified them, and the rest of the cadets proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is simply being in the right place at the right time with enough determination. The invaders, forced fully into normal space, discovered too late that their technological superiority meant nothing against opponents willing to fight with whatever tools were available. In the end, it wasn't advanced weapons that drove them back. It was the simple fact that even dimensional beings can be defeated by determined students armed with improvised weapons and the element of surprise. As the last invaders retreated, Sarah found herself standing with Commander Vexthor in the ruins of the main control center. Emergency power was slowly being restored, casting strange shadows across the destruction. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Yes," Vexthor agreed, his 4 eyes scanning the damage. "But thanks to you, we'll be ready. Not just with our technology, but with something they clearly don't understand." "Sir?" "The ability to fight without it." He turned to face her fully. "Cadet Chen, I believe it's time to make your training program mandatory for all Marine Corps personnel." Sarah looked around at her fellow cadets, aliens of various species who had just proven that unity and adaptability were worth more than any technological advantage. "Sir," she replied with a slight smile, "I think that's just the beginning of what we need to change." In the days that followed, as the Academy began to rebuild, Sarah's words would prove prophetic. The Galactic Marine Corps was about to undergo its most significant evolution in centuries, all because one supposedly weak human had reminded them of a crucial truth. The most dangerous weapon in any battle isn't the most advanced. It's the most adaptable. The graduation ceremony of the Galactic Marine Corps Academy had remained unchanged for 10,000 years, until today. Sarah Chen stood at attention with her fellow graduates in the Academy's newly rebuilt Grand Hall. The traditional quantum-forged metals still adorned their uniforms, but now they were accompanied by something new. Simple bronze pins shaped like ancient earth arrows, marking them as the first class to complete what was now called adaptive combat training. Commander Vexthor addressed the assembled crowd, his 4 eyes scanning the graduates. 3 months ago, this academy faced its greatest challenge. An enemy that could negate our most advanced technology brought us to the brink of defeat. But in doing so, they taught us our most valuable lesson in millennia. His gaze settled on Sarah. They reminded us that true strength lies not in technological superiority, but in the ability to adapt, to think differently, and to fight with whatever means necessary. Sarah felt the weight of that gaze, remembering the changes of the past 3 months. The Academy's curriculum had been completely revamped. While advanced combat systems remained crucial, every cadet now learned to fight without them. More importantly, they learned to think beyond established doctrine. "Cadet Chen, step forward," Vexthor commanded. Sarah moved with practiced precision, noting how her muscles no longer strained under the enhanced gravity. She wasn't stronger than her alien classmates. She never would be, but she had adapted. "Your initial admission to this academy was considered by many to be a mistake," Vexthor continued. "Some believed that accepting physically weaker species would compromise our standards." His mandibles clicked in what Sarah now recognized as amusement. "Instead, you have raised those standards higher than ever before." He gestured to the assembled graduates. "Look around you. Every cadet here can now fight effectively with or without advanced technology. Every one of them understands that rigid doctrine is a weakness, not a strength. This is your legacy." Tellar's multidimensional form sparkled with agreement. The luminary had become one of the most enthusiastic advocates of adaptive combat, using their dimensional perception, in ways their species had never considered before. Crix's crystalline surface refracted light in a pattern of pride. The Petrovi had discovered that their natural forms could be used for far more than just channeling energy. Even Arxix, his carapace bearing scars from the battle, stood tall. He had been one of the first to master the new combined combat forms, proving that traditional strength and adaptive thinking could work together. Therefore, Vex Thor announced, "It is my privilege to present you with not only your commission as a Marine officer, but also your appointment as the first director of the Academy's new Special Warfare Division." Sarah's heart jumped, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, your mission will be to continue developing what you started here. Find new ways to combine the strengths of different species. Teach our forces to think beyond technology. Prepare us for enemies we haven't even imagined yet." He handed her a data crystal. "Your first assignment is to establish similar training programs at all Marine Corps facilities. The frontier attacks have continued, though our newly trained forces have repelled them successfully. We believe it's only a matter of time before we face something even more challenging." "Yes, sir." Sarah accepted the crystal, then asked, "Permission to choose my own staff?" "Granted." Vex Thor's mandibles clicked knowingly. "I assume you already have some candidates in mind." Sarah glanced at her fellow graduates, Tellar, Crix, and even Arxix. Each had proven that their species' natural abilities, when combined with adaptive thinking, could achieve things neither tradition nor technology alone could match. "Yes, sir. I believe the best defense against unknown threats is to be as diverse and adaptable as possible." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in the Academy's tactical training room, where everything had started. The advanced holographic systems were back online, but now they shared space with primitive physical training tools, ready to change the entire Marine Corps. Tellar asked, their form shifting with excitement. Honestly, Sarah ran her hand along a simple wooden staff, a training tool older than human civilization. "I think we already have. The real question is, what do we change next?" Arxix clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "The frontier is vast. There are threats out there we can't even comprehend yet." "Good," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "That means we'll have to keep learning, keep adapting." She turned to face her team, her friends. After all, the most dangerous force in the galaxy isn't the strongest or the most advanced. It's the one that never stops evolving. As they left the training room together, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had arrived as the weakest cadet in the Academy's history, barely able to survive the physical demands. She was leaving as someone who had fundamentally changed how the most powerful military force in the galaxy thought about warfare. But more importantly, she had proved something that humanity had always known, even if they sometimes forgot it. True strength isn't about being the biggest, strongest, or most advanced. It's about being able to adapt, to think differently, and to turn apparent weaknesses into unexpected strengths. The next morning, as her new division prepared to depart for their first assignment, Sarah took one last look at the Academy. The building's quantum-forged walls still pulsed with power, but now they were reinforced with simple physical barriers, a perfect blend of the advanced and the primitive, the new and the old. Just like the force she would help build, one that would face the galaxy's threats not with overwhelming power, but with something far more formidable: the ability to adapt, to learn, and to never stop evolving. High above, the stars beckoned, each one potentially hiding new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to prove that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't technology or physical strength, but the endless capacity to change and grow. Sarah Chen, once the weakest cadet in the Academy's history, smiled. She was ready for whatever the galaxy had in store. After all, that's what humans did best. They adapted, they survived, and they taught others to do the same. The future of the Galactic Marine Corps would be built not on power, but on possibility. And that was a future worth fighting for.